Welcome to America's Heroes Group.
Welcome back to America's Heroes Group. We have a roundtable with our partner, Veteran Advocacy Project. January is Cervical Cancer Awareness Month, and today is Saturday, January 22nd, 2022. Our host is Kelley. I'm Sean Claiborne, the co-host. Our executive producer is Glenda Smith, and our digital media producer is Ivan Ortega of Scouts Honor Productions. And we have a great partner on today, Mr. Brent G. Filbert. He is he's a Pentagon retired 30-year Navy veteran, professor, and the director of the military law and the Veterans Advocacy Project. How you doing, Brent?
I'm doing good, Sean. I'm doing good, Sean. We have a tremendous guest tonight that I'm really excited to start talking with. It's going to be really terrific.
That's right. Brent has brought us a panelist, and that is Justice Eileen Moore. She is an appellate court judge in California and a Vietnam Army nurse back in the day. Mr. Justice Eileen, I'm going to give you my best to do a good introduction for you. You were at the 4th District Court of Appeals, Division 3, and that's in the sunny California in Santa Ana. And you started out, which is interesting, you started out at the Women's College School of Nursing in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and then you went to pivot from being a nurse, going to nursing, into law. You went to Pepperdine University in Malibu, California, to get your JD. Before we get into Veterans Treatment Court, I wanted to just get an idea about what made you pivot, and how does that help you in your job today?
Oh, what an interesting question. Thank you. Well, I came back from Vietnam, and I walked right into the middle of the women's liberation movement. And there I was, the daughter of a high school dropout, a nothing, and a girl. And all of a sudden I realized that it might be possible for somebody like me to study at a university. And I grabbed for that brass ring, and I never looked back. And I just went for it. And all of a sudden, colleges and universities around the country opened up to my gender. Apparently, if you were wealthy or if you came from very smart parents who guided you that way, you could get into college, but not before that. And I went for it. And it wasn't until I practiced law for 10 years, and then sometime I was appointed to the Superior Court, which is the trial court in California. And sometime in the mid to late 1990s, the local chapter of Vietnam Veterans of America called me to speak at some special event for them at the Richard Nixon Presidential Library. And I went out there, and there, off to the side of the auditorium, were 3 rows of disheveled-looking men in old, tattered Army fatigues. And I said to myself, Vietnam veterans, self-medicated, PTSD. And they were there. After I spoke, those 3 rows of men completely surrounded me, and each one had to touch me somewhere. They were touching my shoulder, my arm. One took his pointer finger and was going over the top of my hand over and over again. I can't even remember if they even said anything, but it was as though they were connecting with the fact that I was a nurse. Wow. And that brought back memories of what the guys were like when they opened their eyes in the evacuation hospital in Quy Nhon, where I was stationed. That is, they took one look at seeing an American girl standing next to them, and they knew that somehow they were connected with home and with America. And that feeling with those men in the 90s who had never gotten past whatever it is that they had to get past made me realize that I had to start getting involved with veterans issues.
So give us the birth. When did Veterans Treatment Court actually start, and what was the initial mission, and has that mission changed, and how has it evolved?
Actually, Veterans Treatment Courts are based on the drug court model, and the first Veterans Treatment Court was in Buffalo, New York, and I think his first name is Robert, but it's Judge Russell. I think it's Judge Robert Russell started the first one, and the second or third one in the country was in Orange County, California. And it was started by a friend of mine, Judge Wendy Lindley. And a Veterans Treatment Court cannot exist unless it has some sort of authority to exist. And in California, there are a couple of statutes that allow Veterans Treatment Courts to exist. And the idea is not to punish somebody in the traditional way for committing a crime, but to give them treatment. And veterans are in a peculiar position because most of them don't have any kind of a criminal record before they go into the service. And the recidivism rates for veterans is very low. One study that we did was something like 10.4% recidivism rate for veterans who were successful in Veterans Treatment Court versus somewhere between 66 and 76% of non-veterans. So the idea is to put them back on their feet, to get back to being the good citizens they were before whatever happened to them in the military happened.
And so this is successful then. This is something that actually works. It's something that's been, I don't know if you can hear it. Can you hear me better?
If you could talk a little louder, I'd appreciate it.
Well, she has an audio issue right there. I don't know if they're trying to get that sorted out. Do you hear me better? Is that better?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So walk us through. So this is something that's successful. It's actually been working and it's actually made a difference in the veterans' lives. Now, how is this? What is the next step in this veteran treatment court? Like, what is new that we can do for veterans today to help this program expand and also to do better for veterans in the future?
Well, one of the things that early on there was. The Veterans Treatment Courts were the only game in town, but as time has gone by, the experts have realized that some people need more intensive treatment than others. And diversion courts have opened up for veterans. And what diversion means is that somebody is arrested for whatever the crime is, and if it's a misdemeanor, they never have to see the inside of a courtroom. Well, they're ordered the first time they come to court, instead of pleading guilty or pleading whatever or pleading not guilty, they are sent to a treatment court or a treatment route instead of being prosecuted. So they never have to go through any kind of prosecution, and they don't have to suffer a conviction, whereas in Veterans Treatment Court, which nowadays seems to be reserved for more serious crimes or somebody who needs much more hands-on treatment. So a lot of veterans are going by way of diversion, and that takes probably 1.5 to 2 years to get the treatment, and they can do that as an outpatient, and they never have to have any kind of a criminal record at all. But for Veterans Treatment Court, usually there is some kind of criminal record that will eventually, if the veteran is successful, the conviction and arrest will be wiped from their record.
So there's some exclusions also too I've read about. And so exclusions, if someone does anything violent, that's an issue. Brent, can you comment on that?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Murder, child molestation, very serious crimes like that, they'll never see the inside of a Veterans Treatment Court.
Wow. Now, how do you feel about that part of it, Brent?
Oh, that's fine with me. I don't want.
No, go ahead, Brent. There's a question for us. I was just curious to get Brent involved in the conversation. So.
Oh, sure. Yeah. No, I was listening to. Yeah. Justice Moore, I think he was asking me. So I was just listening because it's just a fascinating topic to cover. So, Justice Moore, I wanted to piggyback on that in terms of, so the veterans that come into Veterans Court, what's the percentage who have issues from their service, like PTSD or traumatic brain injury, that sort of thing? Does that make up a significant portion of the veterans who come into those courts?
100%. 100% of them have either PTSD, traumatic brain injury, military sexual trauma, a mental health issue, or a drug issue as a result of serving in the military.
So this road to recovery, I'm sorry, Brent, but the road to recovery, that process. How much of the onus is on the program versus the veteran? So walk me through that process.
I'm not quite sure what you're getting at. If you could ask that in a different way.
So, for example, so a person gets into the program, and there's a process to try to get them treatment versus punishment. So that process to try to get them to treatment, what does that process look like? So what's step one, step two? I'm assuming get them with a counselor, things like that. How much responsibility does a veteran have as far as, because there's something I was reading in your information. You had Goya was the acronym, basically get off your butt, get off your Goya. So that process of it, that onus part for the veteran actually take responsibility for their actions and for their treatment.
Nothing's going to happen unless the veteran invests himself, and it's usually himself. I don't mean to be sexist when I say that. There are very few women that have been in veterans court, not because they don't commit crimes. I think it's because the veterans courts are geared towards men rather than towards women, and that's something that needs to be changed in the future. But unless the veteran really does invest himself, and for 9 years I acted as a mentor in we have 34 veterans treatment courts in California, and in the first one I was a mentor in there for 9 years, and I usually mentored the young women who got themselves on the wrong side of the law. But I would be sitting in the back of the courtroom, unlike when I sit as a judge, I'd be sitting in the front of the courtroom. So sitting in the back of the courtroom, I could see their backs. And it was really kind of amazing that I could predict when a veteran would be successful. At first, they would come in and they'd be standing before the judge kind of slouched and maybe exhibiting a little bit of attitude. But as time went by, as the weeks went by, and I'd watch them over and over again, you'd see them all of a sudden standing in a proud, at ease kind of a stance with their hands behind their back. And it was at that point when their posture started to change, invariably, that's when I knew that they really believed that they could get better. And I really think that shame plays a big part in this, and they have to get over that feeling of self-loathing, and they have to change the whole way they live, so far as exercise and eating right and staying away from the kind of people that they've been drinking too much with and taking drugs too much with.
So primarily, it sounds like that the big problem is with drug abuse and alcoholism. That seems like the biggest one of the common thread through most of these cases seems to be centered around drug abuse and alcoholism. What are the crimes that you typically see that come out of that type of alcohol abuse and drug use?
Driving under the influence, getting into bar fights, domestic violence.
So these are not things that are like really over the top crazy, like robbing banks and committing murders and things along those lines. These are things that they're basically roughhousing. It sounds in a way. Domestic abuse is a serious crime. That's something that needs to be addressed and something definitely requires therapy. But for the most part, these are crimes that are not that are things that you can recover from.
Well, back to your comment about domestic abuse, I agree with you. But if you have somebody who has gone through an explosion and they have traumatic brain injury as a result of that, that's a different, that not oftentimes, but sometimes manifests itself with some sort of spousal or partner abuse. But it's a different mechanism that's involved there. All of our domestic violence laws are based on the idea of a power and control. That is, there's some bully who wants to control a weaker person. But if you have a brain injury that is part of the cause of what's going on, it's not as though it's any less dangerous for the victim, but the treatment for it may involve bringing in the victim and getting the victim to feel comfortable, and having the family, and if there's kids involved, having the kids, having the whole family involved with treatment together, rather than our traditional way of separating people and having stay-away orders.
So what are some of the penalties that veterans do? It's like you mentioned sanctions and some of the literature and things like that. What are some of the penalties that veterans do suffer if they fail the program, or maybe they don't hold up their end of the bargain? What's the recourse for them?
Well, it's really interesting because early on, the first veterans treatment courts were in 2008, and early on, if somebody were to violate a court order, whatever it was, maybe don't leave the state and they go to Las Vegas, or maybe if on the East Coast they might have gone from Philadelphia to Atlantic City or something, and they violated the court order, judges usually put them in jail overnight, a night or two, so that they would quickly get to know you can't violate a court order. But they found that was kind of first of all, it's a cruel thing to do sometimes if the addiction is the thing that's driving the veteran and they still are addicted. If the violation involved not taking medication and the veteran is sent to jail, sometimes the Americans with Disabilities Act is involved. If they're sent to jail and they can't go to work the next day, then they have to tell their family and their friends, and there's embarrassment, and they're mixing in with real criminals when they go to jail. And there's a terrible sense of shame that comes back. And so as the years have gone by, the courts have learned that something less than jail is more appropriate in most instances. If the violation is relatively minor, perhaps having the veteran write an essay and read it in open court, or maybe a fine would be imposed, and sometimes more frequent court appearances would be required, or community service, but something that's not so obviously a punishment. But the opposite of that is very effective. That is, if the veteran performs very, very well, then doing something, and for example, if the veteran has had no problems and done everything that they should have since their last court appearance, it's very common in a veterans treatment court to have everybody applaud because they're so proud. And there's a esprit de corps in these veterans treatment courts. That is, they're all veterans, and the mentors that are in there with them, and there's usually a mentor sitting down next to the veteran who's gotten himself in trouble, and all of them are veterans, and they all want everybody else to succeed. So, and perhaps the court might have a drawing, and volunteers have sent in gift cards for Starbucks or Amazon or something like that, and they'll have a drawing, and they feel so important when they followed all the rules. They get to have their name put in the hat, and if their name is drawn, it's just kind of fun. So veterans court is an entirely different experience than your traditional courts.
Could you see, this is in a perfect world, that model being transferred over into more other just types of court? Like, could we see this in traffic court? Could we see this in other criminal courts?
Absolutely. In fact, nowadays we have, DUI courts, homeless courts, mental health courts. One court has something called a WIT court, and that's whatever it takes. So this kind of model, that is, we're throwing people in, we're incarcerating them because they're addicted, and all they do is meet real criminals once they're incarcerated. And I can see where this veterans treatment model will translate very nicely into a lot of other areas, so that we can clear out our jails and prisons and as much as possible, and have the really serious criminals the only ones in there.
Yeah, I think that's definitely important. I do see hope, and I see some great things coming out. Today, the show, we had 4 guests on today. We're going to have 4 guests on today. And what they were talking about here in Chicago was using research, getting the data from these treatment courts to actually compare that with real university data to create programs and help try to solve problems, and not just in the back end of it. So when the person commits a crime or commits the trouble or whatever, with a nuisance, whatever, and they get into a program, how do we get ahead of it to stop it from happening in the first place? And I think looking at the solution part of it, seeing what the problems are in the beginning, can help us figure out what do we need to do beforehand so the problem doesn't actually start. I think that's a really great thing. So, Brent, do you have any final words for us?
No, I just would just ask Justice Moore, just what do you see in terms of the future of veterans courts? Are they going to continue growing? Is it going to be something that we're going to see more and more of?
We got 30 seconds.
I would like to see veterans courts geared, perhaps even separating the genders, but geared more towards the needs of women. These military sexual abuse cases are going on day in and day out in the military, and women are getting terribly abused. They're retaliated against if they don't report it, and I would like to see our courts more responsive to that.
Thank you guys for joining us. This is America's Heroes Group, and we'll be right back.